All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our MPCR speaker series that we're kicking off this semester. My name is Edward Hahn, and I'm very happy today to share you some of the ideas I've been thinking about in terms of natural and artificial patterns. So let me just jump in, and we'll be taking questions in the comments, so if anybody's on live stream, put them in the comments, and if we can't get to them live, we'll follow up with you after. So I want to talk about life, I want to talk about biology, and I want to talk about AI in the context of patterns, both recognizing patterns and generating patterns. And so we can think about our entire life as a sort of pattern. Our biological pattern, our mental pattern in our mind, and then the patterns we see in culture and even in the universe at large. And we're going to try to think later in the talk about how we can find patterns throughout the universe. So what do patterns in nature look like? If we had to go out and capture with a camera or take some observations, we might expect to see things like this. But strangely enough, this is not a real pattern. This is an artificial pattern. And we're now approaching the era of passing what was called the visual Turing test, where as humans, we can no longer easily distinguish between natural and artificial patterns. So I want to think today about agents, about life, about little critters that have a goal of just being alive. And how do they operate? And how could we take understanding from these systems and bring it to the technological systems that we're building in our economy today? We can model ants as virtual life forms in a computer program. And this simulation style started back in the mid-'80s. And now we have the ability to scale this up to millions of little agents in the simulation, and maybe more importantly, give them intelligence. Each one of these little critters in these agent-based models could have the potential capability that we see in things like ChatGPT and other large language models. The point being is if we scale out to a certain viewpoint, we look just like those systems. And we have a lot of situations on our planet, problems, let's say, that we're trying to figure out. And can we reverse engineer and take solutions from those world of ants or from the world of artificial ants and try to understand our social problems? So a lot of this lives in an area called natural computing, which is really at the overlap and intersection of a lot of classical branches of science. And when we try to understand things like murmuration and these large flocking patterns, it's not clear if we should use the regular tools from physics or from chemistry, or if we need something different, a complex systems approach, where we try to model how these little agents, we can call them, are interacting with each other. So if we look at this breakdown of natural computing, there's a lot of things that we study here in the lab. And so we can see things like swarm intelligence, or now one of the most powerful technologies on the planet driving large language models, artificial neural networks. And you can see these fall underneath bio-inspired computing. But there's a couple other ways to think about it. One is trying to figure out how nature itself is acting kind of like a computer. Not like an Intel chip or an NVIDIA GPU, but it does things in a very different way, but it does something like computation. And then what we're going to talk about mostly today is this idea of artificial life, where we're going to simulate natural phenomenon in computers, and I would argue that those simulations are getting very realistic in terms of the capabilities of the agents, and very practical in terms of our economy. So like artificial intelligence, this field is not new. There's some great work going back to the 80s and 90s in this field called artificial life, which is kind of like the little cousin of AI. And I would argue in a sense it might be in the long run even more important, because these critters are going to inhabit our world. They're not just going to be browser tabs or apps on our phone. They're going to sort of have their own reality in a sense. This is an early simulation of flocking like we saw. This is called the Boyd's model, right? I think Nancy updated my slides there. And that was a simulation of bird flocking. But we can do that for things that move or things that don't move. And so here is a variety of artificial plants, trees that are generated by fractal algorithms that look strikingly like real trees. And what's amazing is we can now set up this digital forest, and we can have them, evolutionary pressure, like select which one of these are going to survive the next season. And now we can actually let these artificial creatures evolve. And we can give them goals like who can get the best canopy coverage, or what makes the best habitat for squirrels that might inhabit them. But if we add this idea of a selection pressure and choose which ones pass their acorns on, and we have mutation, then we can get this idea of emergence, where we really do have something like the primordial ooze in the early ocean, where life is kind of bubbling out, but in this case of our computer chips. We still don't understand how these systems work. We can't build AI that are anywhere near as efficient as systems like this. Seagulls run on sardines, and now the AI industry is building computers the size of Manhattan, and the power bill to match that. We need to take inspiration from these systems to figure out how we can run on ocean water and small fish, things that are quite sustainable. We need to look at the organization of eusocial species like bees and termites to try to figure out how are they organizing their society? How are they getting rid of their waste products? How are they creating sustainable building materials? How are they making architectures that scale way beyond the understanding of any ant? And these are the things that we need now in our society. Here's a really interesting termite simulation, just like the one that we saw with the ants. And what's really amazing is you can have an incredibly dumb algorithm on these little virtual ants. And in this case, what they'll do is they're going to sort out these little tiles. And so if an ant is not carrying anything, it will walk randomly until it bumps into a particular tile. And if it's not holding anything, it'll pick up that tile, and it will carry it around until it reaches another tile of the same color. And if it bumps into a tile of the same color as the one it's holding, it will just let go of the one it has. It's as simple as that. It doesn't really have any goal. It doesn't have any understanding of what it's doing. But that simple recipe, if we let it run, the ants will sort out all of the different tiles into piles without really knowing that's what they're doing. The recipe doesn't say sort tiles. It just says carry a color if you're not carrying one, and drop it if you bump into the same color. I imagine in maybe 10 to 25 years or so, we'll be able to drop very small robots like this onto a landfill and say, please pile all the aluminum over here, and all of the silver over there, and all of the gold and platinum over here. And we won't necessarily have to have a very sophisticated AI inside each little robot. They could be doing a very simple heuristic like they do in nature here, which ends up building some really tall structures. It's interesting that for millennia, these were the largest structures on the planet. You know, humans, it took a long time before humans could make something that was more impressive than the termite mounds. I'm a big fan of sort of going back to the future. And in the 80s, there was these amazing titles that kind of went under the idea of game, but they also had this simulation in the name. And in this case, simulating life or simulating the entire planet. And I think we need to get back to this approach, and we can beef this up with, one, higher resolution graphics, but also the massive compute capability that we see in graphics cards now. We have incredible memories. When we buy a laptop now, it's going to have gigabytes or terabytes of disk space and memory. And so that allows us to take these simulations and really scale them up. But these were pretty sophisticated at the time, and it was this idea of a digital organism, which is very related to artificial life. And you create something that has a metabolism, maybe it has goals, maybe it interacts with other organisms in the ecosystem. This was the sim life, and you could sort of swap out the roots and the bulbs and things, and you could get different sort of versions of these life forms, and to see how well they were adapted to the environment that you dropped them in. Amazingly, back in the 1950s, Edward Moore started to think about this in a very practical, grounded way. He said, can we have factories that reproduce themselves? Kind of like a 3D printer that makes 3D printers, decades before that idea was around. And they were kind of like little fish, and then here you can see they're called little lemmings. And it says, like lemmings, a school of artificial living plants. And here he's being cheeky. He means plant like as in an oak tree, but he also means plant as in like a factory where you build stuff. And so these artificial living plants swim into this harvesting factory, right? So they go home automatically, and then you can collect the pieces. And what each of one of these will do is this will go out and anchor itself on a riverbed. Here you can see our model, which is the seagulls and the ocean shore. And this is a sort of a Dr. Seuss style conception of what it might look like, at least from the viewpoint of the 1950s, to have an artificial living plant, in this case modeled after the squid. When securely moored, it will begin the process of reproduction. Right? So this is really a very early idea of artificial life, but in the sense that it will do things and harvest raw materials from the world for us. Well, Florida is already full of these little critters. Right? You have them in your kitchen, you have them in your yard, and they are very good at running around and collecting resources, and they have a kind of intelligence that's emergent and distributed. And I think that's what we should expect to see out of the AI. Not every little chip has to be a super intelligence, but when they work together, really interesting stuff will start to happen. So I want to look at how we can find these kinds of patterns that nature leaves, look at its fingerprints, and then reverse engineer it to abstract forms that we can use in technology. And so this is an olive shell, and you can see it has this amazing pattern which is strikingly similar to this Sierpinski fractal. And we can create simulations of this. This is a real olive shell, and this is a virtual olive shell. And we can try to figure out what is the computer program, let's call it, that biology is executing or unfolding that ends up giving that pattern to the seashell. Now, the seashell is a really good example of patterns, but our brain folds have patterns, right? Our fingerprints have patterns, our iris and retinas have patterns. And so that's what we try to figure out, is how biology is capturing and using these patterns. So there's an area called cellular automata, which was largely developed by Stephen Wolfram and John von Neumann before that. And it's kind of a digital physics. It's kind of a graph paper world where we try to figure out what patterns could exist in a very simple universe. And there's an amazing sort of encyclopedic overview of all of this that you can take a look at. It's called The New Kind of Science. We have a copy of it right here in the lab. And it's trying to figure out, how does nature produce patterns? And by following these very simple recipes, we get out rich structures. And so it's kind of like starting with just a very simple ingredient, like say just a bag of flour, and then suddenly you have a 4-layer chocolate cake come out of it. And you think, it doesn't seem like it was in the ingredients. And what Stephen Wolfram was able to show is that a very simple recipe, here you can see the entire program is only 8 bits. And what we do is to figure out what the square is going to be, we look at the previous line, and we look at the neighbors, and we find the matching pattern here. And then we choose the one down there. This square will tell us what the update rule. It'll tell us how this thing is going to change over time. And it's a very, very simple recipe. In a sense, you cannot make a simpler computer program. 8 bits is hardly enough to even write the name of your computer program. But here we can see it creates something. I think of this as like rain on a car window. It looks very natural for something that the program doesn't seem like it would warrant that sort of complexity. What's interesting, Alan Turing, who's essentially developed the modern computer as we know it conceptually, the later part of his life, he was fascinated with animal markings and this idea of morphogenesis, and trying to use computer programs to figure out how these kind of patterns in nature emerge. Because if you're the stripe on this tail, you have to figure out if you're going to be a dark stripe or a light stripe. But every cell has the exact same code. All cells have the exact same DNA instruction set. And so how does a particular cell, whether it's on your hand, know to shoot out a hair follicle, or to skip it and let your neighbor do that? And that is all over us, from the top of our head to our toes and everything else in between. And so we want to try to systematically explore the patterns that we see in nature, and then can we reverse engineer those to try to figure out how we can mathematically instantiate those. So these are some of the patterns that we're developing here in the lab. This is a generalization of the Wolfram automata to use the techniques from neural networks. And we can create a large variety, essentially an infinite number, of these very simple little petri dish worlds. And then we go through and think almost like a hadron collider or an atom smasher. Say, what things show up? If we let this thing run over and over again, do we get interesting critters? Kind of like if we were to take a petri dish and swab all over things and then let it incubate. What happens to that system if we let it run? And so these are essentially digital petri dishes where we can run these virtual worlds and see what emerges. I really like this quote by Immanuel Kant, and he said, "We will never have an Isaac Newton for the blade of grass." And what he meant was the things like the moon and the stars, we can write down formulas. But biology, cells and plants and chlorophyll and sunlight, this was forever beyond humanity, was the idea. And I would argue that that's not the case anymore. We are closing in on this, and I think there's some extraordinary work being done that will take the biology that we have in the world and ground it in the same kind of way that we have in physics. And this will lead to breakthroughs in medicine and longevity and just understanding, our place in this world. So fractals was the other little piece up there next to artificial life, and they're intimately related because we can use all the variety of forms that come from these fractal algorithms and then try to think, okay, is this what nature is tapping into? We traditionally thought that evolution had to find and create and engineer all of these delicate patterns. But it seems more now that these are already out there. That nature is already making use of all of these weird patterns, and that as living systems, our DNA can just kind of find them and make use of them. It can recycle them. We used to think that biology or the world looked like clockwork. We thought we could just make sort of fancy, sophisticated watches, and then that would scale up to robots. We now know that's not the case. We need a different approach. We can't just have a 3D printer print a smaller printer, which prints a smaller printer, which prints a smaller